Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Seattle Pride Presents Demystifying Gender, our fifth, I believe, Pride Speaks event. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Crystal Marks. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Executive Director of Seattle Pride. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so excited to have you and to join this really important, really exciting, engaging topic. I can't wait to introduce you to our moderator so they can introduce you to our fantastic panelists. But before I do, I want to share a little bit about who Seattle Pride is, what we do, and get you involved and excited for tonight. So Seattle Pride, or Seattle Out and Proud, as we are also known, doesn't just put on the Seattle Pride Parade that we all know, love, and miss 2 years in a row. We also put on engaging programs such as this. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we increased our programming 750%. Which is kind of a miracle when everything else was shutting down. So we put on these monthly speaker series, touching on topics such as demystifying gender, parenting LGBTQIA plus kiddos, being queer and running a business, all these different topics, things that are important to our community as told by our community because we are the authors of our own stories. Speaking of authors to our own stories, we also have the quarterly free Seattle Pride magazine. As you see, we have Big Frida on here for our summer issue. We'll be releasing our fall issue September 1st, so look for that everywhere throughout King County, South Snohomish, and North Pierce. It is always free, or you can check it out on our website, even right now, seattlepride.org. We are a 501c4 organization, which means we get to engage in advocacy. What that looks like for us is we get to tell you to vote. If you have not yet voted in the primary election, please remember to do so. It is so important. And enjoy as my children walk around in the background behind me. Before we introduce the moderator, I also want to say thank you to the folks that are putting this on. Thank you to Tim and Noah, the Seattle Pride staff, our friends at Connors and Company for operating everything in the back. We're so excited to have you here tonight. This is a fantastic topic. So let's get into it. Our moderator tonight is Sonj Basha. Sonj is a creative director, facilitator, and consultant based out of Seattle, Washington. And for 10 years, Sonj has been working with teams, movements, and organizations, building capacity to bring forth a more thriving, just, and sustainable world. 32 years of living as an underserved queer and Muslim immigrant has elicited a lifetime of learning of how to bring deep cultural strategy to the forefront of their solutionary leadership. We are so honored to have Sonj as our moderator. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Crystal. I love how you put that we are the authors of our own stories. So much of the deep cultural work that I do in facilitating systems and organizations is bringing forth the wholeness of our story, who we are, what we believe in. And I'm so excited for our group of panelists today to be sharing a window into a little bit of their own story and how I may elicit the wisdom of the lifetime that they have lived, living in this queer moment in time, and how we can start to not just demystify gender, but also work towards gender justice and gender liberation. I am going to introduce each person in so much brevity, in an arbitrary order of operations that has nothing to do with their inherent value or worth, and give each person an opportunity to really speak for themselves. The first person that I would like to introduce is Beau.
Hello, everyone. My name is Beau Bradley. My pronouns are he and they. I am an emergency manager here in the Pacific Northwest, and then I also run a podcast called Beau My God, which is a podcast talking about queer and transgender topics that just hit 1 year this week. So that's exciting. And I love talking about gender, so I'm really excited to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Beau. Really excited to hear what you have to share with us today. We'll maybe just get a snippet of what we could find on your podcast. The next person that I would love to hear from and have introduced themselves is going to be Dean.
Hi, my name is Dean Kubota. My pronouns are he and she, never they. I'm gender fluid. and trans and intersex, and I am half Japanese. I'm halfway Japanese, and I am a radical trans activist. I've done, our project was the mural project, where we worked with community and Seattle Public Utility and my cousin Jade Black, and we put up all of the murals in the CID for free and encouraged artists and educated shopkeepers about BLM, encouraged artists to put pro-Black Lives Matter murals up. And then we did the Save Our Seniors Vaccination Project, where we, basically did translation work and transported seniors to vaccination sites, so that in the height of the pandemic, we had all of our non-English speaking seniors, which we have over 1,000 of them in the CID. All of our non-English speaking seniors were able to have that kind of access. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dean. Really looking forward to hear about some more of your work and how you show up in the world. The next person I would love to introduce themselves is going to be Listo.
Good evening. My name is Kalisto, affectionately known as Listo, which means ready in Spanish. My pronouns are he, ze, and they in English, and em in Choctaw, L in Spanish, and ile in French. I am Zooming from St. John Valley, or Sear Plantation, Maine. I am a former resident of Seattle for 6 years. I am the founder of Syzygy Passings, a death guide service. I am a consulting assistant with Epiphanies of Equity out of Seattle, Washington. You might have recognized me from marching with Gothic Pride Seattle for the past 4 years prior to this pandemic happening. And I am glad to just still be able to join remotely from wherever we are. I identify as a gender fluid adoptee. I am Black, Indigenous, and autistic. So have a good evening, and look forward to how this turns out.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it as well. So this evening, we are going to hopefully be having conversation that is juicy, that is expansive, that drops us into a better understanding of not just who these panelists are, but maybe how we navigate and understand the world at large. Some of these questions are going to be using words that might mean different things to different people, like gender, but also like normative or normal or normativity. And as the moderator and wearing my facilitator hat, I like to just create a little bit of a framework as I move into that. And this is coming from my center and my heart space and how I'm going to be posing these questions. And the framework that I'm going to pose is that normativity, for me, equates to gender construction as a colonial project, and that it often is inherently a false narrative of delusion and supremacy and the ways in which it's opposed onto the larger structure of who we think we need to be. That gender oppression is actually how trauma is institutionalized. And that perhaps, just perhaps, through these questions and through this conversation, that true liberation and justice can be more than just making space for diversity, but can also bring forth the systematic accountability to heal and transform and ultimately dismantle the status quo. So that's what I mean when I say normative and when I use words like gender norm. But I'm really excited to use that language to start to ask the questions that are going to elicit the wisdom of our panelists. And so with that, I would love to move into the first question. The first question that we're asking is, how do you think that your gender shapes how your family, friends, colleagues, and ultimately the community at large interacts with you? I would love to pass this question into a conversation between Kalisto and Dean. Whoever feels more compelled to share first. The mic is going to be yours.
I guess I can go. I really appreciate that voicing about how one interacts with the community, because how gender shapes how my family and friends ultimately react or work with me is a lot different from how my colleagues and community have interacted with me. I worked in a variety of different capacities through my transition as a gender fluid person, as a person who's transitioned from traditionally female to more masculine presenting. And part of that aspect that was difficult for me to discern as a Black Indigenous person, and a person who worked as a historical reenactor for 8 years, was preserving the history of people that I was reenacting while actively transitioning out of the gender of some of the people that I was historically telling the stories of. I could think of a story today, too, as a person who worked for a bi and for trans organization in Seattle that now lives in Maine, where the X gender marker is recognized, but live in a more conservative part of Maine, where we consider the northern part the other Maine, and it's a little bit more conservative than a more populous city. And I went to amend my gender marker, and all they did was just stamp it. Had I been the person offering that service, I might have said, congratulations, this is a big life change that you're making, and I hope it all goes well. But otherwise, there's kind of like that brick wall that gets put up, and there's explanations that our community has to give. And there's that settlement between, do I explain myself free of cost so that people can understand the lives of gender fluid and trans people? Or do I not have a voice and just take and roll with the punches? But I have a supportive family and a community that I kind of have to crawl back into the proverbial closet and read the room and test the waters. Pass it off to Dean, if you have anything to say.
Yes, thank you. That was a really excellent answer. I would say, first off, there's kind of like a short answer, which is that I culturally experience a lot of various reactions. The Asian American AAPI community is extremely vast. You know, I'm Japanese American, but my family immigrated straight from Japan to Hawaii in the late 1800s. People don't think of Japanese Americans as being American, and because I grew up in the occupied kingdom of Hawaii, I wouldn't have considered myself American either. But at the same time, culturally, I was both very Japanese and also raised in the diaspora in Hawaii. Third gender, mahu, was always present around me, but it was also seen as a pejorative because of the influence of missionary work in Hawaii. And the Japanese American community, their understanding of gender roles, you know, while it's not influenced necessarily so much by Christianity, is still very much present and very much influenced by imperialism and also by blood quantum and just, you know, straight gender roles. I've kind of found that I was very, very fortunate growing up in Hawaii, being kind of in this sort of bubble where, like, even though the Japanese American community did not always accept my queerness, I never passed as not intersexed. I never passed as straight. I never passed as cis. And I was constantly breaking gender roles. The Kanaka Maoli community was always very kind about it. You know, a lot of Kanaka Maoli people were mixed Japanese. So they always embraced me. And I grew up around people that were very proudly mahu. But I also grew up seeing those folks being abused by both our community and people outside of it. That being said, you know, I think it's kind of funny because, like, people read me and the community will read trans folks often very accurately to their gender and not realize it when someone is more gender ambiguous looking. So, for example, I primarily identify as I am a transgender man. And my community here in Seattle and in Chinatown, a lot of the elders who don't speak English read me as an Asian man, but they think that I'm a transgender woman. So they like, if they don't like me, they'll misgender me and call me he, and I'll be like, oh, thank you so much, because I'm AFAB. So I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you, auntie. But then they get really confused, and as they like start to like get to know me, they read me as more as a woman because they're like, oh, you're so pretty and you do makeup so well. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you for acknowledging my gender fluidity. And they're just completely at a loss because they don't understand that that's a space. Also, very quickly, the gender that I have is actually really old, and it's a part of my culture, but it's been forgotten and pushed to the side in a lot of different ways. One of our major gods in Japanese Shinto is Inari Okami-sama. And Inari Okami-sama is a big god. They're a god that came from Indian Buddhism. They're the god of rice, the god of swords, the god of strategy, the god of childcare and sex work and cross-dressing and makeup. And the fact that this god is both extremely important in samurai culture, which is what Japanese culture is associated with, is trans, and that being trans is holy. It really helps for me that even when my community doesn't embrace me, I remember that that's not always how it's been, and that's not always how it will be.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dean. I really appreciated both of those. And just quickly before moving from this topic, because we have so much to speak about, I wanted to ask if, Beau, you had anything that you wanted to respond to enter your voice into the space.
The only thing I think that I want to add is just to kind of highlight on what both of you already said, in that just the intersectionalities that being trans has, because we all aren't just trans, we're trans, and there's no just. And I also identify as non-binary, and so I don't think that people are exclusively one or the other of that as well. But I really appreciated learning more about both of your cultures, so thank you for sharing.
Perfect. Thank you, Beau. Thank you, Listo, and thank you, Dean. There was an aspect to the responses of both of those, all of those, which was not just how we are navigating both our ancestral knowledge and how that impacts how we show up in the world based on our perceived identities. But I heard in both of those this relationship to land and like where we are, and hearing the experiences of both of you, one being in Maine and one being in Seattle in the International District, and how like ecological justice and the way in which land really influences how others perceive us and how we're treated and how we navigate. So I really appreciated that that narrative, and just the idea that place really does shape us and shape our experiences. With that, something else that really shapes us other than place, and often is directly associated with place, is childhood. And the next question is really about the impact of enforcing gender norms, again, gender normativity, but really also the gender binary onto children. And I would love for you all to hear your wisdom just around what you think the impact of how we enforce gender normativity and the binary on children's is, maybe through your own personal experience as a child, or maybe through what you've come to learn as you've stepped into your power around your own gender. So yeah, if we want to kick off this question response with Dean, I would love to hear from you, and then we can make some space.
Thank you so much. So first off, a little bit about my background. So my bachelor's degree is in English. My master's in fine arts was in children's literature. And I also have my CDA in early childhood education. I've been working as off and on as a teacher since 2006. And after I transitioned, you know, the education system was so hostile and so difficult to work with, not because of the children, but because of the administration, that I had to leave education permanently and retire from it. And, you know, knowing as much as I do about children's brains, knowing as much as I do about the development of children at so many different stages, because I had the privilege to work with children as an infant specialist from the time that they are an itty bitty 6-week-old infant to working with, you know, juvenile probation folks in the probation system, you know, as teenagers, like seeing that range of like where folks are, and also seeing like the evolution of like myself becoming more and more radicalized as I figure out my gender. You know, I was always kind of like realizing like, wow, this, seeing how gender has affected me and how gender being enforced on children affects them, like this has been, it's been very interesting. So straight off, right off the bat, we always talk about how gender binary is a box, but in Japanese American culture, that box is smaller. Men are seen to be more stoic. Model minority says that Asian American people and Asian folks are not allowed to fail. They're not allowed to be bad at things. And they're specifically, definitely not allowed to be bad at things that are deemed as what Asians are good at. But if they are good at it, it's just seen as a part and parcel of being Asian, not a part and parcel of hard work. And, you know, as far as the binary is concerned, in Japanese culture, like Nadeshiko woman is like the perfect Japanese woman. She's soft-spoken. She's demure. She defers to men. she never talks out of turn, and she hides her mouth when she laughs or eats. And being a street, raised in poverty, mixed Japanese intersex kid, I was always getting into fights and defending my Mahu friends, and I was very loud, and I didn't fit that binary. And I was very lucky that I had a family that was more liberal in some ways, but it would show up in that people's parents would tell their children that they weren't allowed to play with me. And, you know, there were toys and traditions I wasn't allowed to access. For example, like the windsock you see with the koi fish for Boys' Day. So Boys' Day and Girls' Day is a very gender binary thing. Boys' Day is considered Children's Day. It's just considered the day, you know. And Girls' Day, they have dolls. Now the dolls are connected to like feminine power and protection in Shinto, but primarily also like if you're a boy, a cis boy, or assigned gender at birth boy as a Japanese person, you're not allowed to have and participate on Girls' Day. That's their day. Your day is for the windsock. And if you are a Japanese girl, you get a doll, whether or not you wanted one. Like, so I feel like with my studies about children, you know, understanding that from the doll test all the way back in like the 50s, what we're doing to kids by telling them that they can only operate in this box, and it being smaller for people of color because of the result of colonialism, imperialism, and internment, it makes it very hard to exist as a gender non-conforming person. And that's how the system works. But if we question that system as adults and we model it towards the children, and we say, no, you don't get to tell my child that they don't get to play with dolls. My child gets to play with whatever they want to play with. We are showing that child that space, we are going to make it safe for them.
Wow. I feel like I want to take like a long pause after you speak, Dean. I really appreciate both, the insight to your own experiences and just how much wisdom you bring about your culture and how it meets those experiences. I really appreciate you speaking to that. And I would like to open the space up if Kalisto and Beau have anything pressing to speak on the topic, really briefly before moving into something that is very connected.
I could maybe spend like 2 minutes on it. Initially, I hadn't thought about like concept of gender binary for myself, since I often look back on how I was raised. I was raised pretty non-binary, with my parents referring to me by my first name. And I transparently share with this space that my first name is pretty similar to my legal name after I transitioned. And when I think of names for my children, as I'm currently family planning, the name Kawena means death perseveres. And that was my dead name, and I would pass that on to a child. But that aspect too of the history that one passes on, and the centrality of gender in Polish Romani culture and indigenous culture, although Two-Spirit can be talked about and revered, even though it's been pushed back significantly. But surprisingly, my African culture from Benin and the Dahomey warrior woman makes me feel more confident in my gender. And looking back at the matriarchs and patriarchs in my family, like my Uncle George, who was on a boat that brought slaves to freedom on the Mississippi River, makes me think of what can I impart to my children without imposing gender roles. Because I was never told you should stay in the kitchen or cook or clean, and creating that divide and raising more and imparting more about caring for the world around us, I feel is something strong that our generation, the millennials and the Gen Zs, can bring towards the children that are being born today.
You can move along if you want.
Great. Wow. It's really insightful for me when I hear others' stories around gender and things like childhood, especially when there's so much wisdom on this panel around ancestral knowledge, and the ways in which we call on the context of our experiences and where we're from. And with that, the cycle of our lifespan, and really advocating for justice in dismantling ageism also means that we have not only a duty and an honor to our children of the world, but also to our elders. And so this next question really tries to bridge that gap of how we think about gender normativity. And I would love to hear from our panelists how you speak about gender norms to the elders in your life. And why is it important? It's a big question. It's a question that inevitably and inherently it works towards bridging gaps, cultural gaps, gaps of time, gaps of ideas, especially in a moment of time that's so revolutionary. So I would love to hear whoever feels called to speak first to this question, how you speak about gender norms or about gender in general to the elders in your life.
I would love to speak on this because it's so. I have sort of an interesting background in that my father was also a radical activist, but also transphobic, which is kind of that thing where you have folks who are cisgender and they think they're so radical, but they're homophobic or transphobic, and they think that they can exist in activist spaces and be those things. So even though like my dad was like a pretty well-known like civil rights activist and housing activist back in Hawaii, like I don't have any contact with any of my immediate family. When I moved out here to Seattle, when I moved into the CID, when I started the mural project, I met Miss Nora Chan. And Miss Nora is like 4'10". She's, from Hong Kong originally, and genuinely the most kind, wonderful, accepting person. And it's funny because she scares the snap out of everyone. Like she when she saw us building the murals, she said, "Who is building these murals without permission?" And I was like, "I was me." And it started this very interesting friendship. She's known that I was trans from the start, and really gave me space to just be myself. And in a very Asian American way, was like, I don't care what your gender is so long as you work hard, which, is kind of hilarious to me, and a lot of my Asian elders are like, we don't care what your gender is. You have a master's degree. And I'm like, well, that's not equivalent, but thank you. Like, I feel like they're starting to sort of catch on, but also I'm just very blessed to have folks that understand me. How I kind of work with the elders. A lot of our elders are English as second language speaking. And we have to acknowledge that a space is not accessible until it's language accessible, be it if that's for, the hard of hearing, for, the non-sighted, or, for everyone. Like, it needs to be language accessible. And a lot of these languages like Toisan, Ilocano, and like different languages, especially Pacific Islander languages, or like Southeast Asian languages like Khmer, those spaces, like our spaces our queer spaces need to have these languages, because so many of our elders are queer and they don't know it. Or they're queer and they don't know it's okay. It's kind of like, folks being in a war, still thinking that the war is going on and not knowing that it's okay to come out. Like, these elders think that like only young people come out as trans. Only young people are trans. That's a new hip young people thing. But when we explain to them, like, no, it's not. And it's actually really old. It's, I think, really revolutionary to the quality of life that they can have, that they can live their truth, that they can have their partner, and in their last years of their life, they can be themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dean. I recently have taken on a liking to the word transcestors as well. And your share made me want to just big ups and pay homage to all of our transcestors as well, knowing and unknowing, as you'd like to say. Would anyone else like to share how you speak about gender norms to the elders in your life?
I can speak to that aspect. My grandma has dementia, and I've been transitioning for the past 9 years. And I think to myself a minute that she looked back at a photo and there was my sister and our cousin who looked very similar, and she was like, "Those are my girls." And then she looked at another part of the photo. It was just divided in that sort of way. And she's like, "And those are my boys." And I felt affirmed because she'd recognized that I no longer identified as who I was previously. And I remember a photo that my mom sent me last Christmas where they made wreaths together. And as a person who works as a death guide, a hospice volunteer, a funeral director, an embalmer intern, I was like, I applaud that you're doing that artful activity that is simple and something that is short that she can remember. And I think to the aspect of children's books, and it stems back to how we educate the children, how we educate the elders. And one of the things that my local library does is bring large print books to the senior center. And when I was in Seattle, I sat on a couple of board meetings that were towards creating the LGBTQ Senior Center in Seattle. And I wrote a pre-plan naturally myself as a funeral service professional that said, if I get put in an old folks home, it has to have drag queen bingo, a swimming pool, and somewhere for me to garden. And I thought to myself, how can one educate the elders who have this suppressed aspect of gender identity and the aspect of, do I come out at 60 or 70, even though some LGBTQ groups, because of how short our lifespans are, a 35-year-old is considered an elder. But I said, what if I brought in a Todd Parr book? And if folks are familiar with children's literature, Todd Parr wrote the book, What Makes a Baby, and We're All One Family. And it's just a way that short, simple, and engaging. It just has to come from that elder that doesn't feel that it's a bad thing to read a children's book, because there's pictures, there's short words, there's blocks, and it's something that they can relate to and maybe understand. And it's a positive thing, whether it's playing music, maybe a song about gender expression, or reading a book that I feel can get that point across in a contextual way that everybody can feel welcome.
I just wanted to I just wanted to add that also, though, folks shouldn't feel pressured to try to educate people that aren't ready, and they may never be ready. Like, my dad and Miss Nora are the same age. Miss Nora and my dad are both 75. And my dad has known my pronouns for the entire time that I've been out. So 5 years. And Miss Nora knew my pronouns when I introduced myself as trans. My dad is a radical activist, and Miss Nora is known for being very conservative. Miss Nora is also a devout, Mormon, and she is, very much about protection. And, I'm an abolitionist, and she is, to my understanding, pro-police. And yet we still, meet in the middle about protecting Black people and protecting the elders and holding police responsible, And even though we are going to agree to disagree about a bunch of things, she still makes that space for me. I think, for some folks, they're not ready. For some folks, they're not going to ever be ready. And I cut those people out because my life is too long to be miserable.
Thank you for sharing that, Dean. That actually really beautifully weaves us into, so then how do we create spaces, right? When we think about moving from land to children to elders, then we get to this really sometimes tricky and sticky and often empowering space of our peers. And those folks that we consider to be our peers. So this question really has to do with how we call those people in. And I would love if, Beau, you could bring your voice into the space to speak to how do we create that? What do we recommend to gender normative people? whether those folks are cis or within our own queer community, in order to stretch their thinking around gender norms and expectations, and expand the conversation and ultimately create more space for liberation.
Sure, thank you. Honestly, the first thing I recommend to anyone when it comes to talking about gender, whether they believe they have a strong sense of it or they've never thought about it before, I really am just a strong proponent that every single person should question their gender. I think that if you go through a questioning process and just take time to sit and understand why you feel the way you feel, what gender roles or gender norms, as we've been discussing, you feel you do fit within, don't, because gender is fluid and it is changing. It's not a constant state. And so to be able to sit with that and learn, you're either going to just affirm what you already know, or you're going to maybe learn something completely new that could feel really, really good. And the other thing that I would recommend is just to practice using gender neutral words, because it can be really easy to assume someone's gender or assume what you think someone would like to be referred to as. And it's just, you can be wrong so much more often than you can be right. And it's painful and awkward for everyone. And just trying to use gender neutral language in general, I think is really beneficial. And again, just practicing using gender neutral pronouns, they, them, until you get to ask someone. If you meet someone for the first time, you can always kind of bridge that awkward gap by just starting with your name and pronouns. And if you introduce it to them, they just might introduce it right back. And the best thing of feedback I ever got regarding that was that it, I'm sorry, completely lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. Thanks.
No, that's perfect. It's what you said was so powerful in its brevity. This idea of like how radical it would be if we actually just created the space for everyone to question themselves and have that actually becomes the norm. And it doesn't mean that we're calling on everyone to be queer and trans, although maybe, but it really means we're calling on everyone to find the space to show up as their authentic self, right? And this piece recently about, I loved what you said, Beau, about also practice making perfect. And for me, I often meet folks who live within the normative structure by saying it's not actually about accepting me. It's about practicing how to love yourself so much that you're so comfortable and you're so authentic and you're so real and you're so working on your own healing that inevitably the space is there for me. So thank you for bringing that in, Beau. That was super powerful. Yeah, calling on everyone to question yourself and to practice making space for others. The next question that we're going to move on to is, I guess, in line with that, what are some advances in the discussion around gender? What are ways in which we can not only call on our peers, but what are some of the conversations that are happening? What is the status of this radical world that we live in around gender? I feel like this panel, you have such a diversity of identity and experience and theory. I would love to hear, just what you feel like is actually happening in the world right now that's really pushing us forward. The stage is open for anyone.
I can start. I think one of the coolest things, honestly, that is really underrated, at least as a millennial in my generation, the ones above, is just social media and the connections that you can make on social media. And living in the era where everyone can throw out a tweet, or there's podcasts where you can just talk directly to other people about how you feel and anyone can listen to it. It leaves so much more room for representation, visibility, and connecting people across from countries, or even just like the next state over, the next town over, the next area. So I think that just the internet and social media alone have been such big, bright things for the queer community.
I completely agree. And I would like to add that, you know, the internet, we really take that for granted. But, you know, I feel so. I was born in '88, and Hawaii is about 20 years behind the continental United States. So, like, we didn't really have like the kinds of access to like internet until kind of a little bit later. But still, yet the fact of like being able to connect to other queer kids and other queer teenagers when you're like the only goth Japanese queer person in your town and possibly like one of four on your island, like, and there's no way for you to be around other goth queer kids. It's a real, you know, things like MySpace and Gaia Online, these spaces are so important. I think also, like speaking to what Beau said about representation, you know, indie media and media that is made us for us by us, like YouTube and content creators and like TikTok, for example, especially like people of color, like people of color artists, we don't have to rely on that middleman as much. We can design our own websites, we can write our own narratives, and we can distribute it in such a way that our target audience isn't white and it isn't cis and it isn't straight. And we don't have to cater to those spaces in order to be heard.
Absolutely. Kalisto, did you want to add to what you think are some of the biggest advances?
I do like the discussion around social media and making better use of the internet. I used to despise Clubhouse, but I've liked the different discussions that I've had there. I've liked the connections that I've made on TikTok and Instagram. And then there's also the discussions independent of social media, like pronoun signatures in emails, and what does that look like for folks? Because I've had times where I put my pronoun signature and folks have called it either unprofessional or shouldn't everybody already know my gender? And then it turns out that the only gender fluid trans staff member is the one with their pronouns in the signature. And it just looks like me trying to make the change. But also then there's that other discussion around people going, well, couldn't they just refer to me as my first name? And that discussion around, forget that last question, but circling back to normalizing asking people for their pronouns, even if it makes the cis folks uncomfortable, because it's important to recognize that instead of just going, well, I'm just going to use the name, and then eventually I'll slip and use whatever pronoun I feel fits your presentation. And that is super uncomfortable for many trans folks in community. I could say for myself, but I can't really speak for others on that, but in that aspect. And I think that there's a positive sway in media to a degree. It isn't perfect yet, but getting more trans and gender nonconforming actors and actresses and just folks with acting experience roles playing trans characters. And it circles back to that library discussion I had earlier about talking about books that people can relate to. I've had elders that are really invested and interested in the New York Times bestsellers, and I didn't get a library job because I don't read the New York Times bestsellers. And as a queer person, I don't really feel comfortable going, I read a bunch of shifter and genderqueer and MLM romances and then recommending it to whoever comes into a library circulation desk. But getting more of those in on screen and having more podcast discussions around open conversation, and creating playlists around like, here's songs that only referred to folks as they, them, or sie, them, zir instead of she will be loved. But I digress. That's how I feel like media can advance and folks can feel seen.
I love a good juicy digression. So thank you for speaking to that. Absolutely. Just want to reflect back in all of what you shared that that language is like a radical factor in how we move culture forward. And when it comes to pronouns, when it comes to social media, as an unabashed young queer becoming person on Tumblr, I can't imagine what I would have been if TikTok was around. I would have been so much more gay so much sooner. So thank you for bringing all of those points up. Our very last question, we just have a couple minutes, is how can we, within the queer community, the queer being an umbrella of all of it as an acronym, really, and allies, advocate on a daily basis to broaden the understanding of gender? Yeah, do y'all want to speak a little bit more to like that personal day-to-day outside of these larger structures? Like, how can we actually work to continue to broaden our ideas?
I can speak to that, and circling back to what one of our panelists said earlier about should LGBTQIA folk have to do the work. And the topic that I'm going to focus on right now is that some of the work that one has to do to make these gender norms in daily life present can re-traumatize and trigger. So one of those things as an aspect of a person who's worked in several professions that are male-dominated, white male-dominated, in a state that isn't predominantly Black, and in an area, academia hasn't really been meant to serve BIPOC folks in the way that it should be. But in that way of introducing gender norms and trying to create a safe space for us, not only in our homes, but in our communities, in our workplaces, is finding allies that can reach out to these businesses and these community leaders and these places that provide services for our community. And having that service that's the Trans 101 for educating the ally, but having the ally that can reach out on behalf of the trans person to kind of test the water to ensure that that place could potentially be a safe space for the trans person to eventually work, to eventually seek services, whether that's a gym, whether that's a library, whether that's outdoor recreation center, daycare, hospital, etc. But that main part about finding allies so that the LGBTQIA are not re-traumatized by trying to find a way to get these gender norms recognized in community.
Yes, absolutely. Dean, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I was just going to say that in a couple of the groups I moderate, we really import the importance of paying your educators. As somebody who was an educator for a very long time, there's a culture in this country about undervaluing education, especially education coming from people of color's first-person experience. And I want to say that, you know, when people expect you to educate them for free, they're expecting free labor from you. And it's very demoralizing because it's like they expect you to convince them to treat you like a person and with respect and dignity. And I think that, you know, passing the mic to people of color about their topics, not white-splaining, not speaking over them, making spaces, you know, disability accessible, language accessible, intersex accessible, making sure that people know that like there isn't just allosexual transgender people, there are intersex transgender people, and making sure that, putting out that tip jar as a person of color, being like, I'm going to stand by the fact that I will happily educate you. Here is my Venmo. Like, I'm not going to educate you for $1. I have a master's in fine arts, and I really appreciate if you respect that. And even if I didn't, because of those kinds of gatekeeping, you should still take my words and my first person experience as truth, because from the academic perspective, that first person experience is seen as the highest level of academic like understanding when you do first person interviews. So still yet, even if you went by that academic standard, you should still listen to people of color first.
I want to just throw confetti after both of your shares, virtually throw confetti. Yes, to not putting all of the work on trans people and trans people of color. Yes, if you are going to put that work on trans people or trans people of color, pay them accordingly, for goodness sake. Thank you for bringing up both of those points. We are now at a time in our discussion, in our expansive connection, and in our attempt at 1 hour of liberation to move into Q&A. It sounds like there's been some really excited audience members that have brought forth a couple of really great questions that I would love for folks to be able to speak to. Yeah, speaking of labor, the first question is like around actually what's felt really good. What's felt really good? What's been the best part? The question says specifically, so that I can verbatim quote our audience member, what has been the best part of being free of gender constructs?
I can start this one. So I honestly think the best part about being free of gender constructs is the ability to kind of just embrace your authenticity and just be your full self. I know growing up, I was someone who always, well, not always, I just did not understand that you could question your gender. And I didn't understand that there was life outside of the sex you were assigned at birth. And so for me, it's been kind of embracing my femininity and embracing these parts of myself that I closed myself off of for so long because I didn't want to be seen being AFAB. I didn't want to be seen as just another girl. So I think the best part has just been being able to embrace all of the parts of me that I had to shove away to fit into a box.
I would add for like myself. So as somebody who's gender fluid, and I've been on testosterone for 5 years now, and so I have a very like deep voice, and I pass on the phone as AMAB, and I often forget that I'm AFAB. I really love doing drag, and even though like let's just be real, RuPaul is extremely transphobic, um, and RuPaul's Drag Race is very transphobic. I think that the fact of like Pose and other media like putting ballroom back into the hands of like Black trans creators brings me just so much joy. And being able to do like draglesque and boylesque and like empowering that space and that sex worker space and that sexual space as like an Asian femme that people always assume is like being trans and Asian, like, oh, futanati, and oh, it must be about porn. But the reality is like I really love to like make people a little uncomfortable and just like really push their boundaries about like what they think Asian women are and Asian men are, because then it's like it's kind of like the Regina from Mean Girls thing where it's like, oh, like oh, you really think I'm a girl? What makes you think that? You know, what kind of gender constructs did you have growing up? Do you feel like you're cis? Like, you know, I like putting people on the spot when they put me on the spot. It's very gratifying.
Listo, did you want to speak to this question?
Yeah, when I began my transition, I felt like I was trying to stick within the binary. Yet after my medical transition, I realized I felt a lot more confident in thinking outside of the box. In Pride 2019, I decided to walk the Pride Parade in a hoop skirt and a Victorian morning dress. And that was right after, believe it was Billy Porter wore the dress to the Grammy Awards, or maybe it was the Oscars. And now when I like go in my closet, there's like the clothes that I identify with. There's my partner's clothes. And then we like share the aspects of clothes. I like to think that his part of the wardrobe has goth or golf, and my side of the wardrobe is more like how can I express my culture in whatever ways possible, whether that's really casual or really fancy. I've gotten more comfortable with veiling my hair again because I always associated the veiling as when I was part of religious traditions that wanted the assumed females to wear veils. Now I just veil and don't try to ascribe a gender to it because it makes me feel like I don't have to do shit with my hair every day. And there's also that aspect too that carries over to my interior design, what I want my kids to wear, or letting the kids have their own gender expression, and just not, I had times where my dysphoria played too much role and it took me too long to leave the house, honestly. Now it's like I put on clothes as long as it's comfy and as long as it's clean. I don't care the gender that society wants to placate what the clothes mean.
I'm snapping. You can't see my fingers right now, but I was snapping while you were sharing around that. This was such a powerful question. I have free tattooed on my hand. I think that if we are to think that edges are where we grow the most, then let us continue to be our authentic selves and have discomfort be the way we change the world. So thank you each for sharing your response to that really, really special question around what it means to be free. We have another question from the audience that I would love us to speak to, and it feels directly sort of elicited from the conversation that we had around questioning. This question is, what does it mean to question my gender? How do I even do that?
So I guess I'll start. So a very abbreviated little note on gender. It really is built up of two things, which are your gender identity, or how you perceive your own gender, and your gender expression, the way that you project your gender to the world. And if those things line up, theoretically, if you are, say you were assigned female at birth, and then your gender identity is feminine and your gender expression is also feminine, and you line up straight across that line, in theory, you're cisgender. And then if you don't, or you're kind of don't line up in this theoretical exercise, you kind of fall between the lines, or you could identify as genderqueer. It breaks down to really just being about how do you feel inside, how do you want others to perceive you, and what feels the best. I think a lot of what being a part of the LGBTQIA+ community is just embracing your own identity and embracing everyone else's identity, and just kind of ensuring that everyone has the space and the ability to be themselves.
That's fantastic. I agree. I was going to say, so if you're questioning your gender a lot, my sweet baby eggs, like if you're questioning it a lot, cisgender people don't question their gender. And I know that like, that's like, oh my gosh, But like, you know, if you're having that Mulan moment as an Asian, where you're like looking in your reflection, because Mulan is like our trans Asian representative, man. Like, you know, she's gender non-conforming. You know, her boo Shang is just chaotically bisexual. Like, you know, she's saving China. But like also, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be uncomfortable in it. Like, I thought for the longest time that I wasn't trans because I didn't hate my body. And, you know, I've had access to therapy. So I just figured that like my discomfort was like because I had a really messed up childhood. But then I was like, oh, other people don't do these things that I do. I realized that it wasn't normal to cross dress with your partner and for you to like go by different names and both you and your partner to be cross dressing and just live in those characters. Like, you know, I think that if you feel like you just want to run away to a city, change your name, have people not know that you were the assigned gender you were, or have people question your gender, or you don't want to fit in a gender role, that you are enough and you're valid and you're on the trans spectrum. And anybody who wants to tell you otherwise is trash. And, you know, there's lots of fish in the sea, but there's also lots of trash. So don't worry about it.
There's also this really important part to the question of how I do that. I'm wondering, Kalisto, if you want to.
Yeah, I think that that I can answer to kind of how do you do that. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. I came out at 12 years old as same gender loving. At the time, I was AFAB. I assumed I was lesbian at the time. I was a person with long hair that cut my hair to kind of be that tomboy short, and I feel that there was a lot of masking. There's the autistic masking, and then the trans masking, and then the black burnout, and then the autistic burnout, and the trans burnout, and it's like how do you do that? There's no right or wrong way to be trans. There's no right or wrong way to be gender fluid, and that just experiment. If you have that freedom of capacity and you're at that point in your life that as we mentioned, having supportive elders or having supportive parents that are just like, well, this is what they're going to wear now. I had a time that I wore a kilt that my mom brought back from Ireland as a college student, and somebody called it my man skirt. And I was like, I don't care. It's a plaid skirt and I'm punk and whatever. If you want to call it my man kilt, whatever. And I've had times where I would wear like neon pink pants with yellow road stripes with a green shirt. And I think that also kind of plays a role with my mom being like, you're too goth, you wear too much black. So I took that neurodivergency, shoved it, and said, I guess instead of wearing all black, I'll wear neon for 3 years. And just experiment and find people that are open to you experiencing that, that need to experiment, and seeing that as a courageous moment. Playing dress up is something that young folks do, and there's things that I look back on and go like, yeah, I think I probably was trans and I didn't have words to put into it. I didn't know what anthropology was until I majored in it, but I was doing anthropology all of my life. And there's that part of identity. I remember in 8th grade, I came back from summer vacation, and right before going back to school, instead of focusing on the school supplies I wanted, I said, how can I make the kids at school think I'm a different person? So I tried to do all these different things to try and make them be like, there's a new kid in school, but it's not. And I think back to what would happen if I went back to the school that I left because I was bullied. And I just get that entertainment off of being like, well, here's, hey, look, mom, I made it, I guess, is how I see that. Go back into the world and be like, this is all that that I'm doing for the community. This is who I've become, and I do look different than what I did look like back then.
I love hearing all the stories. I can see all of the experimenting and all of the different phases. And I think it's such a powerful narrative that queer folks have, is the dynamicism that we each inhabit based off of our stories. And yeah, we didn't dive too much into it, but gender is so much about expression, right? It is an embodied experience. It does have to do with our bodies and sex. It is in relationship to sexuality. Often the discovery comes through our relational aspects with others, but gender is really about expression. And I love that all these stories of responding to this person about how they can experiment or question their gender has to do with just like experimenting and having fun with the way we express ourselves. And finding spaces where we can really do that. So thank you all for sharing. We have just a couple minutes left, and we do have one more question from the audience. And this one is perfect to sort of re-ground us in the work that we do, because these panelists are clearly so wise, clearly so cool, and clearly do a lot of work in communities. So this question is directly about what organizations are actually doing work in the gender sphere. And maybe you all could speak to what organizations you know of, but really, yeah, what's your organization? What do you do? What's being done in the world right now? This is kind of your plug.
So I like to joke that my organization, my business, is just a giant finger to like Republicans, and like, you know, it's just like a one-stop Republican hate shop, because so we are a all BIPOC, predominantly trans witch shop that practices indigenous magic and indigenous religion. We also serve domestic violence survivors and give free readings to domestic violence survivors. And we do curses for pedophiles and rapists. And what? Against pedophiles and rapists. We don't serve them, we curse them. So our handle is witchforhire.gay. I have to put it back up because I've been going around, but also our Instagram is witch.for.hire. Yeah, it's just witch for hire. And then we also have, I'm going to be having an art piece up in the Wing Loop Museum, the Asian American Experience, on August 6th. And it's talking about how my work was stolen as a transgender activist. And of course, you know, when somebody steals your work, you got to make them famous and make it into art. So I sort of talk about how people stole Marsha P. Johnson's work and stole the work of the people I really admire, and you know how I had to do survival sex work to survive, and I use like my nudes in my art. So you know, we also support sex workers in our organization. We really try to include folks who don't feel comfortable in churches, who have been abused by the Christian church, the Catholic church. And, you know, we really try to go out of our way to really serve community and be language accessible. Also, we do adult sex education classes that are emphasis on BDSM and partner relationships. And my queer platonic partner, Teferi, Laughing Fox, is Homa and Chata, and he is also a minister and works the shop. So he leads the shop. I'm the owner, and then all of our staff are people of color.
Well, there's one organization that definitely is doing some gender justice work, I'll tell you that much. Do either of you want to speak to what organizations are doing work? What work are you doing?
I guess I could speak. There's a couple of local organizations that I've worked with, but the work that I'm doing right now is death care, which for focuses on pre-needs and pre-plans. So most of the work I do is death cafes, which is a space where I don't talk, I listen to people talk about their lived experiences and how they could have a more comfortable relationship with the end of their lives. As a suicide survivor myself, and as a person who has lived rurally, I would also kind of speak towards other organizations in Seattle that are doing that work. Would be Gender Spectrum, Queer the Land. I was a former mentee with Alphabet Alliance of Color, Equity, the Epiphanies of Equity, where I'm a consultant, is doing work around disability, justice, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I am currently one of the artists in residence, well, at my home for 10 Tiny Talks, which is a group of performance artists ranging from poets, musicians, circus artists that is based out of Portland, Oregon, but artists from all over the United States that are speaking around various topics, but are all BIPOC and trans.
Beautiful.
I will just add on to that, the two organizations that I am working with, one being Cheer Seattle, which is a queer-friendly adult all-volunteer cheerleading team here in Seattle. There's actually some across the country in all different cities as part of Pride Cheerleading Association. But I've been a member of that team for a little over a year now, or just about a year, and it's been great for community, great for connections, and for fun. So that is around if anyone is interested. And then also I just briefly again wanted to mention my podcast, Oh My God, which you can find on your favorite podcast platform, or on Instagram at Oh My God Pod, or at beaumygod.com. Thanks.
Perfect. Beautiful. So much amazing work happening. Thank you so much to each panelist for offering your time, your space, your energy, your wisdom. This has been an hour and 20 minutes of pure magic. It's divine, and I know how much energy and work it takes to really put yourself out there. So thank you for plugging each and every one of yourselves. My name's Sonj Basha. I'll keep it brief. You can go to sonjbasha.com. I'm a facilitator, consultant, creative director. I work with a ton of organizations across Seattle. I've spoken with Seattle Pride in many different facets. And for anyone that wants to continue the conversation, if you were inspired by what you heard, if you want to discuss things, if you want resources on how to navigate any of these issues, you can continue the conversation inside of this. You can also just feel free to log in and create an account and just keep the juices flowing. I really, really hope that you keep in touch with each of these panelists. I hope that you keep in touch with each other. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you having each and every one of us.